Efficient Market Hypothesis, What Are We Talking About? By Bernard Garian and Ozgur Gunn. Abstract. The efficient market hypothesis is omnipresent in theoretical finance. A paper published by Eugene Fama in 1970 is supposed to define it. But it doesn't, and this leaves the door open to different interpretations of the hypothesis, causing lots of confusion. In 1978, Arthur Jensen, a Harvard professor, famously wrote, "I believe there is no other proposition in economics which has more solid empirical evidence supporting it than the efficient market hypothesis." Probably few people agree nowadays with Jensen. How, after the 2008 global economic crisis, can someone claim that there is a solid empirical basis for the proposition that markets are efficient? Although in recent years finance has become much more important, as a percentage of GDP and profits, and complex, the social system in those years has not changed radically. And aren't financial collapses, recessions and depressions empirical evidence and as old as capitalism? Of course, Jensen has in mind another set of evidence when he claims that the efficient market hypothesis (EMH) has a solid empirical basis. So the question is, what is the exact meaning of the EMH and what kind of data is used to test it? The usual answer given by academic papers and textbooks to this question is to refer to the most quoted article in Financial Economics, Efficient Capital Markets, a review of theory and empirical work, published in 1970 by Eugene Fama in the Journal of Finance. It seems, thus, that the EMH was born, or at least acquired its ultimate and uncontroversial shape, in 1970. However, Fama's paper presents itself as a review of theory, that is, a review of a theory or of theories which existed before 1970. Long before, according to the English Wikipedia, the efficient market hypothesis was first expressed by Louis Bachelier, a French mathematician, in his 1900 dissertation, The Theory of Speculation. And even much longer before, according to the webpage Efficient Market Hypothesis, History. It traces the EMH back to 1565. There is plenty of information about financial theory and its evolution on this webpage. Because Fama's 1970 paper is presented by this webpage as the definitive paper on the efficient markets hypothesis, we will give it special attention. About Fama's definitive paper on the efficient markets hypothesis. Fama starts his paper by evoking economies, capital stock, and ideal markets, where the resource allocation process is the result of production investment decisions made under the assumptions that security prices at any time fully reflect all available information. Right after these allusions to a real economy, Fama states the sentence commonly presented as the definition of an efficient market: a market in which prices at any time fully reflect available information, is called efficient. Fama is more cautious than his followers. Unlike them, he avoids the word definition or any equivalent expression. He is aware that a sentence which includes the undefined, vague expression, fully reflect, can hardly be given as a definition, something stressed by the use of the quotation marks. By the way, it is rather astonishing that the most quoted paper in financial economics uses quotations marks to characterize the concept that brought him fame. All through the paper, Fama uses 15 times quotation marks for the expression fully reflect. He is, of course, aware that such a fuzzy phrase cannot be used for empirical work. The definitional statement that in an efficient market prices fully reflect available information is so general that it has no empirically testable implications. But he cannot remain so general, as one of his tasks is to review empirical work. Thus, in Part 2 of the paper, he proposes theories with testable implications. The first three subpart titles, Expected Returns or Fair Game Models, the Submartingale Models, and the Random Walk Model, suggest that at least three different models or theories can be associated to the fully reflect expression. Those models differ in some aspects. For instance, martingale or submartingale are less restrictive than random walk, but they all imply that past and present information cannot be used to predict the future in a way which makes expected profits greater than they would be under a naive buy and hold model. In popular language, fully reflect means here that, in general, nobody, even professional investors, can beat the market. Capital markets are efficient if they behave as fair games, where the mathematical expectation of the speculator is zero. See Bachelier. The fair game hypothesis has two aspects: no arbitrage opportunity, and unpredictability of security price variations. Empirical tests can then ascertain whether arbitrage opportunities existed in the past or not, and whether information extracted from past data on security prices, such as serial correlations, linear dependencies, or more complicated patterns on the data, could have been used to correctly predict price fluctuations. Alfred Cowles provided in the 30s empirical evidence in favor of the fair game hypothesis. Randomly selected portfolios, or unmanaged indices, do as well or better than professionally managed portfolios after expenses. Subsequent evidence largely confirmed this hypothesis. See for instance, Malkiel, 2003. The remainder of Fama's paper is dedicated to the review of the evidence. He reviews tests in random walk literature, such as serial dependency, normally distributed price changes, etc. and of martingale models, splits and the adjustment of stock prices to new information, impact of public announcements, and of monopolist access to some information. One of Fama's main conclusions is that, at this date the weight of the empirical evidence is such that economists would generally agree that whatever dependence exists in series of historical returns cannot be used to make profitable predictions of the future. So, there is nothing new in the 1970 paper, except omnipresence of the word efficiency, in relation to the fair game idea. However, the choice of this word, and of the expression efficient market, is not accidental. A scrutiny of Fama's papers shows that it appears in them both before and after 1970. From intrinsic value to the joint hypothesis. According to the EMH History webpage, in his PhD thesis of 1965, Fama defines an efficient market for the first time in his landmark empirical analysis of stock market prices that concluded that they follow a random walk. So, already in 1965, Fama associated efficiency with random walk. But he then went further. In a paper, Random Walk in Stock Market Prices, published in the Financial Analysis Journal in 1965, a non-academic review, he explains that, in an efficient market, competition among the many intelligent participants leads to a situation where, at any point in time, actual prices of individual securities already reflect the effects of information based both on events that had already occurred and on events which, as of now, the market expects to take place in the future. In other words, in an efficient market, at any point in time, the actual price of a security will be a good estimate of its intrinsic value. Then, in other words, efficiency means not only that security prices random walk, but that they wander around their intrinsic value. Fama does not define this value. He only explains that, in the terms of the economist, intrinsic value is an equilibrium price, which depends on the earning potential of the security. This earning potential depends in turn on fundamental factors as quality of management, outlook for the industry and the economy, etc. That is, factors in relation with the real economy. In 1965, Fama's point of view was, thus, not very different from that of fundamentalists. He only added that the many intelligent traders neutralize any systematic behavior of security prices toward their intrinsic values so that uncertainty concerning intrinsic values will remain, and actual prices will wander randomly, that is, in unpredictable ways. Turning now to the definitive 1970 paper, we observe that any reference to intrinsic value or to anything similar has disappeared. But, as we will see, a significant flaw in this paper will in turn prompt Fama to return to the idea of intrinsic value, or, in the terms of the economist, to the idea of equilibrium price, although with different words. Stephen Leroy was the first to point to the flaw. In a paper published in 1973, he remarked that the equation supposed to characterize market efficiency is the tautology. It is quite surprising that the most often quoted paper in financial economics has such a flaw, and that referees didn't see it. In a reply to Leroy, Fama admits that, since the publication of the Efficient Markets Review paper, many readers have commented that they find the discussion of the theory misleading, or at least difficult to follow. When such judgments are made by knowledgeable scholars like Stephen Leroy, the author is forced to agree. Rather than defending the presentation of the EMH in his 1970 paper, he proposes to present the model in a different way, which consists in introducing a new concept, the true expected price of a security, different from its market-assessed value. True refers to values in a model of equilibrium, in the same way that intrinsic value is the equilibrium price, in the terms of the economist. An efficient market is now such that the true expected return on any security is equal to its equilibrium expected value, which is also the market's assessment of its expected value. True expected return takes here the place of fully reflect. Fama makes no mention in his paper to the intrinsic value, but there is an obvious link between securities' true prices, given by the model of equilibrium, and their intrinsic value. As only assessed values are observed, and as with the new presentation of efficiency, tests must be based on the model of equilibrium, it follows that any test is a joint test of efficiency and of the model of equilibrium. Now, joint tests means that the theory is not falsifiable if the data doesn't fit with the efficiency hypothesis, whatever that is. There is always the possibility to accuse the underlying model of equilibrium of not being the appropriate one. Leroy's article of 1989, Efficient Capital Markets, in the Journal of Economic Literature, summarizes the situation. The failure of many financial economists to appreciate the extent of the gulf separating market efficiency, interpreted as economic equilibrium, and market efficiency, interpreted as the Martingale model, has led them to vacillate between viewing market efficiency, on one hand, as hardwired into their intellectual capital and unfalsifiable, and on the other hand, as consisting of a specific class of falsifiable models of asset prices. This is most evident in Fama's 1970 discussion, where market efficiency was described as a substantive theory generating falsifiable predictions, but where at the same time the mathematical formulation of the market was tautologous. Fama's 1970 paper made no allusions to true laws or returns and to joint hypothesis. It generates falsifiable predictions about securities prices patterns, professional versus index randomly selected portfolios average gains, etc. Following the tradition of Bishalia, Cowles, Kendall, Samuelson and others. After his reply to Leroy, Fama kept on defending, in fact, the fair game version of the EMH, essentially on an empirical ground. For instance, when in 2010 a journalist of The New Yorker asked him, "The fundamental insight of the efficient market hypothesis is that you can't beat the market?" He answers without hesitation, "Right, that's the practical insight. No matter what research gets done, that one always looks good." Now, replacing beat the market by market efficiency might cause some problems. For economists, efficiency has a precise meaning, Pareto optimality. That is, a property of resources allocation, which has little to do with stock markets and speculation. On the contrary, there is a close relation between Pareto optimality and general competitive equilibrium, through the two welfare theorems. It seems then natural to put forward this particular model of equilibrium, as it is suggested by Fama himself at the beginning of his 1970s paper. With, as a result, even more confusion. From model of equilibrium to fundamental value. The first critics of the 1973 version of EMH, which distinguish between the assessed and the true value of a security, came from scholars such as Robert Schiller, who pointed to the statistically significant difference of volatility between stocks' prices, their assessed value, and real variables related to their true value, for example dividends. To quote the EMH history webpage, "The stock market does exhibit excess volatility. The measure of the excess depends on the model of equilibrium variables chosen. The fundamental value of a firm, that is, the present discounted value of its expected future payoffs, is one of the most popular of these variables." A quotation from Schiller, one of the initiators of the excess volatility thesis, gives a good example of the shift in the EMH interpretation. The efficient markets theory reached its height of dominance in academic circles around the 1970s. At that time, the rational expectations revolution in economic theory was in its first blush of enthusiasm. The idea that speculative asset prices, such as stock prices, always incorporate the best information about fundamental values, and that prices change only because of good, sensible information, meshed very well with the theoretical trends of the time. The fuzzy idea that prices fully reflect all available information is replaced by the fuzzy idea that prices always incorporate the best information about fundamental values. Also, when Schiller explains that the anomaly represented by the notion of excess volatility seems much more troubling for efficiency markets theory than some other financial anomalies, such as January effect or the day of week effect. He mixes up two different interpretations of the EMH, the fair game one, the January effect, or the day of week effect are anomalies, as they imply that the past can help predict the future, and the stock prices give a good estimation of firms' fundamental value. 1. There are hundreds of papers, popular and academic, where these two interpretations of EMH are mixed, or confused. For instance, here is what a paper recently published in this journal said: "The efficient market hypothesis states that asset prices fully reflect, without quotations marks, all available information. This excludes the possibility that trading systems such as the stock market based only on current available information have expected profits or returns in excess of equilibrium expected profit or return. Fama, 1970. Prices are equal to their fundamental value, and thus investors receive what they pay for. In terms of market applications, this would suggest that an investor would have no capacity of beating the market in a persistent way, and that investing in index funds would be as good as any other strategy. Or, again, in an efficient market, there are no arbitrage opportunities and the prices must equal to the present discounted value of expected future payoffs over the asset's life. EMH. Fama's discussion of the efficient market hypothesis was, at least during the 70s and 80s, vague and fluctuating enough to allow many interpretations. This cannot be said of the theories reviewed by Fama in his 1970 paper, in particular of Samuelson's. Samuelson, not guilty. Paul Samuelson is often introduced as the father of the efficient markets hypothesis. For example, on the EMH History website, Samuelson provided the first formal economic argument for efficient markets. His contribution is neatly summarized by the title of his article, Proof that Properly Anticipated Prices Fluctuate Randomly. He correctly focused on the concept of a martingale, rather than a random walk, as in Fama. Of course, Samuelson does not use the term efficient markets, or even the word efficient, or efficiency. He deduces from the two following basic assumptions. 1. There is a posited probability distribution for any future price, whose form depends solely on the number of periods ahead, over which we are trying to forecast prices. 2. A future's price is to be set by competitive bidding at the now expected level. His basic theorem, the theorem of fair game future prices. There is no way of making an expected profit by extrapolating past changes in the future price, by chart or any other esoteric devices of magic or mathematics. Or, in other words, the market quotation already contains in itself all that can be known about the future, and in that sense, has discounted future contingencies as much as it is humanly possible. It is true that this last sentence has a kind of Fama-like flavor, but there is no expression between quotations marks or reference to any of sort of efficiency. Above all, Samuelson carefully warns that one should not read too much into the established theorem. It does not prove that actual competitive markets work well. It does not say that speculation is a good thing, or that randomness of price changes would be a good thing. It does not prove that anyone who makes money in speculation is ipso facto deserving of the gain, or even that he has accomplished something good for society or for anyone but himself. It seems as if Samuelson tried, without success, to prevent what was going to happen 5 years later, when Fama established a link between his result and market efficiency. He is also cautious about the significance of the posited probability distributions for futures price, his theorem's main assumption. I have not here discussed what the basic probability distributions are supposed to come from. In whose mind are they ex ante? Is there any ex post validation of them? Are they supposed to belong to the market as a whole? And what does that mean? Are they supposed to belong to the representative individual, and who is he? Are there some defensible or necessitous compromises of divergent anticipations patterns? Do price quotations somehow produce a Pareto optimal configuration of ex-ante subjective probabilities? This paper has not attempted to pronounce on these interesting questions. Quite some questions. Samuelson's principal merit is to prove that the fair game result does not depend on positive probability distribution for futures prices. In particular, the sequence of futures prices quoted today does not need to be Gaussian, or the sequences of futures prices do not need to perform a Brownian motion or a random walk. Bubbles can develop, whatever is meant by that, provided that they are incorporated in the positive probability distribution. The price sequences may contain statistical dependencies, though it is not possible to deduce from past variations the sense and intensity of their variation tomorrow. Stock prices fluctuate randomly, in Samuelson words. And that's it. Ideology. According to Bradford DeLong, a failure to distinguish between the no-free lunch and the Price is Right versions of the efficient market hypothesis has been the source of a great deal of very bad economics over the past generation. No free lunch can be taken as synonymous with fair game, and Price is Right with prices give a good estimation of fundamental value. Now, how is it possible that a generation of economists has failed to make this major and obvious distinction, and that the idea of an efficient market hypothesis was so easily established in the 1970s, and is still accepted, both by its defenders and its critics? Only ideology, strong a priori beliefs, and circumstances can explain Fama's decision to term the old, peculiar Samuelson no-free lunch theory, efficient market hypothesis. In 1970, Fama was professor at the University of Chicago, where the new classical macroeconomy was elaborated, on the postulate that an economy is always, thanks to rational expectations, in competitive equilibrium. Efficient resource allocations, that is, Pareto optimality, results from this postulate, at least if market failures are excluded. Contrary to the old monetarist, Friedman, tradition, external shocks, even those provoked by government discretionary actions, are not supposed to generate inefficiencies. Agents can be temporary, fooled, but they always realize their optimal plan. Markets became a sort of deus ex machina which instantaneously reallocates resources in an efficient way. In a nutshell, they are efficient. That is a postulate, an a priori belief, not a testable result. Fama and the new classical macroeconomists typically use the same vocabulary. For instance, in his famous article Expectations and the Neutrality of Money, Robert Lucas talks of the true probability of prices, and explains that the current value of X is fully revealed to traders by the equilibrium price. Contrary to Fama, Lucas does not use quotations marks when using the expression fully revealed, as he give it a precise meaning. X can be deduced from the price, through the one-to-one relation P equals F X, where agents know function F. Also, by true probability of prices, Lucas means the actual probability when expectations are self-fulfilling, rational. When he notices that, the assumption that traders use a correct conditional distribution in forming expectations, together with the assumption that all exchanges take place at the market clearing price, implies that markets in this economy are efficient. He establishes a clear link between efficiency and resource allocation in a competitive equilibrium with market clearing price and correct expectations, that is, self-fulfilling. Likewise, when he explains in his 1978 paper, Asset Prices in an Exchange Economy, that the analysis is conducted under the assumption that, in Fama's terms, prices fully reflect all available information. He means that agents can deduce hidden information from prices and act on the basis of this information to generate these prices. This deduction is rendered possible because the model is reduced to the intertemporal choice of a representative agent, who knows the transition function that governs an entirely exogenous production process, and behaves as a price taker. Very little information is needed, at least in the self-fulfilling equilibrium. The representative agent intertemporal choice is often taken as the model of equilibrium in the deviations from fundamental value version of the EMH. Besides, in their 1981 paper, Grossman and Schiller take the 1978 Lucas model as point of departure to prove empirically the excess volatility of stock prices compared to discounted value of a firm's lifetime dividends. In summary, only ideology, in this case, the indisputable beliefs prevailing in Chicago University in the 70s and after, explains how Fama could transplant without real opposition the concept of efficiency from the world of goods allocation, where it is well defined, to the stock market world, where it is fuzzy and misleading. Is there a right price for assets? In a Financial Times article in 2009, Richard Thaler, a behavioral economist, rightly stresses the confusion between the two different interpretations of the EMH. Some economists took the fact that prices were unpredictable to infer that prices were in fact right. However, as early as 1984, Robert Schiller correctly and boldly called this one of the most remarkable errors in the history of economic thought. The reason this is an error is that prices can be unpredictable and still wrong. The difference between the random walk fluctuations of correct asset prices and the unpredictable wanderings of a drunk are not discernible. But, in the same article, Thaler explains that the EMH has two components that I call the price is right and no free lunch. The price is right principle says asset prices will, to use Mr. Fama's words, fully reflect available information, and thus provide accurate signals for resource allocation. Thaler, contrary to his golfing buddy Fama, clearly distinguishes two components in the EMH. He unintentionally exposes the ambiguities of the 1970 paper, as he quotes its only sentence related to the second component, provide accurate signals for resource allocation, when the rest of the paper exclusively treats the first interpretation of the EMH, no free lunch. The EMH's two components versions result from Fama's 1970 and 1973 papers, although the Chicago Economist claims that the 1973 paper presents the 1970 model in a different way. Thaler has the merit to clarify this point. But, by doing so, he is forced to introduce a new concept, the right price, which corresponds to Fama's intrinsic value or model of equilibrium price. Thaler admits, however, that a theory of how prices are supposed to behave is then needed, which makes it difficult to test the second component of the EMH. In fact, the test is not difficult, but impossible. The right price, or otherwise the intrinsic price, or the fundamental value, is an empty concept. Prices depend at least as much on the models or the theories in investors' minds as on outside information. Those models are the result of their education, their past experience, their mood, and the way they foresee the future. Samuelson's posited probability distribution is an instance of that sort of model. It represents the common belief about stock prices movements. New information affects in different ways investors' beliefs. Changes are usually smooth, but may occasionally be abrupt, as it happens when investors become suddenly pessimistic and shift suddenly from one model of the economy to a very different one. In summary, new information is incorporated in prices, but the way they reflect it depends on countless factors. objective and subjective, impossible to disentangle. Conclusion. An educated economist knows that efficiency means Pareto optimality. That is, extremely stringent conditions. When markets prices are involved, these conditions are: 1. An auctioneer who sets prices for present and all future goods, conditional to all states of nature. 2. Price-taking behavior, that is, belief that it is possible to buy and sell whatever one wants at these prices, without influencing them. 3. Agents' demands and supplies are added and compared by the auctioneer, and, when equilibrium prices are established, exchanges are organized without costs by the auctioneer, who makes sure that conditional goods are furnished as states of nature became effective. Indeed, equities and stock markets are not needed for achieving Pareto optimality, that is, efficiency. At competitive equilibrium prices, firms' present and future profits are known, and their owner, households, know the amount of dividends that will accrue to them during the firm's lifetime. The present value of its dividends can be taken as a firm price or value, but there is no incentive to buy or sell it or its stocks. An intertemporal household budget constraint does not change if he buys or sells a stock, and gets or does not get any more dividends. So, the set of Pareto optima cannot be reached, even approached, in a market, hence decentralized economy, with or without stock markets. Talking about market efficiency should be prohibited. At least for an economist, neoclassical or not, who knows what the words mean. Unhappily, the expression market efficiency has surprisingly been accepted with no real opposition by the economic profession, and is still widely accepted. Only ideological pressure, stronger since the 70s, can explain such an anomaly. Even if it be that after the 2008 collapse, few people still claim without reserve that markets are efficient. Clear thinking should require a return to the situation prevailing before Fama's 1970 paper. Nobody felt then the need to refer to market efficiency when formulating theories about stock markets. The proper way to proceed is to ask well-defined questions such as, do stock prices follow a random walk? Are arbitrage opportunities left? Can regularities observed in the past be utilized to predict future price variations? How do we explain that some hedge funds or investors, for example Buffett, Soros, Druckenmiller, etc., seem to be able to beat the market consistently? Unfortunately, discussions focused on the validity of EMH will probably continue, and confusion will persist, with time and energy lost in vain.